Welcome in, everyone, to a very special episode of the Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches podcast. Today, we're actually celebrating a huge milestone. It's our 350th episode. When I first pressed record back in January of 2019, I really couldn't imagine the journey that we've taken over the years. The podcast has actually had different names: the Enneagram in Your Real Life, Doing What Matters, and now Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches. But in every season, one thing has stayed steady and remained the same. We've actually showed up every single week without missing one. Now, we have done a few replays while I was on sabbatical last fall, so I have to be honest. But we're grateful. We're just so grateful today to you, our listeners, and those who've been a part of the journey clear back since 2019.
We are grateful. And Teresa, I love how this milestone reflects one of the core components of the real life process, which is review. Mm-hmm. It's a practice of pausing and looking back to celebrate where you've been and looking ahead with intention to where you're going. And that's exactly what we want to do today on this episode. We want to review the story of the podcast, highlight some of our favorite moments, and then dream about what's next together.
You know, Eric, when I think about it, it isn't just about a number. You have taught me so many times and modeled so many times this idea of celebration for me, and that we need to pause and celebrate. I have a tendency to just move forward to the next thing and gloss right over. But over the years, just in how you're wired and how I'm wired, you have encouraged me to stop and reflect on God's story and how it's being written, even through something as simple as this podcast, and leaning into the future and what's the fresh vision. So I'm actually going to turn things over to you, and you're going to guide us through some questions, and we're going to have some discussion. And then together, we are going to talk a little bit about the future.
Well, it is always good on a journey to reflect, and you named it. We're not going to stay there, but we're going to start there. If you're driving a car, the rearview mirror is small, but it's necessary. So we're going to use it here. We're going to look back and review the journey a little bit. And so, Teresa, just as you think about that very first episode, you named it, it was January of 2019. I remember the first time I was driving down the road in my Toyota 4Runner, and I remember when the episode came up and I saw the graphic for the first time right there at the episode number. It was a milestone moment. But when you think back to that first episode, what motivated you to start the podcast?
I remember when I actually started the business in 2017, podcasting, to be honest, it wasn't new, but it was probably in its early year. Now, you know, it's so popular. Everybody has a podcast. Everybody's doing podcasting. It's a little more saturated, to be honest, than it used to be. But back in 2019, I was listening to a lot of podcasts. In fact, it's how I got introduced to coaching, is through Professional Christian Coaching Today with our good friends, Chris McCloy and Kim Avery. And so I just knew the value of what people could learn through podcasting. I wasn't sure what I had to bring, but back then, one of the things, and still to this day, that I was passionate about was the tool of the Enneagram. I knew enough to say what can make me unique and different and stand out. And to be honest, that tool was super popular back in 2019. Ian Cron had rode The Road Back to You a few years before that. You and I had both done Enneagram certification with Claire Lowridge. In fact, they were one of my first guests on the podcast because of that topic. So I think I knew enough to niche down to something unique and have a topic that could be uniquely found and searched. And I was really motivated by that. That when I came into coaching, that was like the tool maybe that made me stand out a little bit in the world of coaching and was unique to me. So I just had this drive to say, I'm not ready to write a book yet. I had walked through some really hard things just a few years before that. Wasn't sure how much of my story I was ready to share. But I really love the medium of words and conversation. I love to talk. If you've listened to the podcast, you know that. So it seemed like the right fit.
And I love that you highlighted the unique message just to get your voice out into the world. I remember you saying if you had the opportunity to have 50 people come or 25 people come and just listen, would you say yes? And that was one of the motivators to go, yeah, I can do this. And so, did you imagine then that you would be now looking back and saying, we're celebrating 350 episodes?
Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. And I can say this, Dan Miller, one of my mentors for years, of course, he had a podcast as well, 48 Days to the Work You Love. A lot of people in that circle and mastermind had a podcast or were playing around in the podcast world. Dan actually said to me, Teresa, I don't know that you should do a podcast about the Enneagram. He took that back a few years later because really when that podcast first came out, it was actually usually in the top 50 podcasts on the Enneagram. Jeff and Beth McCord were talking about that topic and they had a huge podcast. So people would search a word like Enneagram and they would find me. And so we did some of my most proudest work, I think, is those first 100 or so episodes. We did that for almost 2 or 3 years, I think, around the podcast being on the topic of the Enneagram. So, still a great resource. If you love that tool and want to go back and listen, you can't go wrong. The information is evergreen and it hasn't changed, which is one of the other things I love about podcasting. It's just great free information that you can put out into the world.
Mm. Yeah, and you named it right up front as we kicked off our conversation today. But the podcast has gone through 3 different seasons and names. And so as you look back through those, how does each one reflect, where you were personally and also professionally at that season or time?
Well, you've walked all of these seasons with me. Actually, when I first started, I don't think you were working on the team yet. I think you were still in ministry. If you don't know that story, Eric and I worked together for several years on church staff. And I left a few years before she did. And then she ended up coming to join me part-time and, different things. So that's been a whole journey, we could say too. But the podcast kind of follows that story. Another thing I love about the consistency of content is it actually ends up telling your story. And the podcast does just that. So Enneagram, what I was known for, what I got into, did a lot of interviews on the podcast around the Enneagram, talked about that. But then I felt a shift. And you and I had so many of these conversations about being known for something is great, but it can also box you in. And knowing when to pivot in business is huge. And I knew that I could spend the rest of my career being known as an Enneagram coach, or that could be my thing. But as I was coaching with people and developing out, and I love, love, love the tool. I just told you before we hit record, I attended an Enneagram virtual event a couple weeks ago, and I'm watching the replays, and I forget sometimes how much I love the tool, how much has been a part of my story. But it is just a mark in our story of information, and it can be transforming and all those things. But I knew there was so much more, and I was starting to develop out the process that we use, the modern day rule of life process called the real life process. The 4 components, we mentioned one of them earlier, this rest, renew, and review, which is what we're doing. And I knew that I needed to shift, and I could stay the Enneagram in your real life, or I could move into something different. And we did. We shifted as the book came out. So I wrote a book in 2022. And as that book came out, we shifted the podcast to be more about the rule of life, about the content that we were creating. I would have guests on to talk about how they had chosen to do life differently, to live in some ways countercultural to the rush culture. Started really talking about living from rest, not rush. And all of that kind of began to shift. I have to think back. Did it shift to the Real Life Process podcast first and then to Doing What Matters? So we've actually gone through 4 titles. Now that I think about it out loud, I'll
Yeah.
have to go back and look at all our graphics. But I think it shifted to the Real Life Process podcast
Mm,
for a season. And then when the book came out in 2022, that phrase, do what matters, we shifted the podcast to doing what matters.
mhm.
And we really were continuing to flesh out content. One thing I would say there, just as you're listening in and you're thinking, would I ever do a podcast? Would it be a form how I would put in content? Doing the podcast each and every week, forcing myself some weeks to sit with my content and my message and my brand. What do I want to speak into the world? What do I want to say? Really was part of me fleshing out even writing the book and what went in the book. Still to this day, you and I will have conversations, and Erica's been on the podcast more than anybody else, and we'll talk about it, is now one of the shifts that we made as she co-hosts. But I am amazed sometimes at what comes out of our mouths and what we say, and I go, oh, that's good. We should talk about that more. We should
Mm,
say that more. Um, we should highlight that. We should teach that in our coaching network. So because I'm a verbal processor,
mm.
the podcast has been a place for me to do that with really good friends, with you as a co-host. So yeah, it's just the coolest experience. And now we do it specifically in a specific way, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
I love just the authenticity and also the vulnerability to go, it shifted. And so, done is better than perfect. I heard at the recent summit we hosted, like, you're the only person that's going to be the lifetime member or person in your business. So as you
Mm,
grow,
so true.
you've just heard that in your story, you've also not moved away from, but moved forward with, because I think all four iterations of that podcast definitely were milestones. And so great places to celebrate as we look back. Well, let's continue even into celebrating some of these big moments as we're kind of
Mhm.
stacking the stones today, looking at what's marked the moments for us. And so over these 350 episodes, you've done solo teaching, we've had guest interviews, now we're co-hosting. What are some of your favorite episodes or moments that stand out to you?
This is really hard because 350 episodes is a lot. And I did the math and it doesn't come out exactly perfect, but it's almost 7 years.
Mm,
So this January, we will
yeah.
start our, so 6 years and 7 months. That's a long time. I've changed so much. You have changed. We've had guests on throughout the year. I think you were on episode 3. So you've
Mhm.
been here since the beginning in some way, shape, or form. And then, kept being on throughout all those years. It's hard to say. Probably some highlights for me of big guests or whatever you would say is Dan Miller, my mentor. I
Mm,
remember when Dan
yeah.
was on early on and talked about his Enneagram type 5. It
Mhm.
was just such a vulnerable podcast. If you knew Dan, Dan passed away a few years ago and miss him dearly. But if you knew him, he didn't go into his own story often. So it was fun to just have that conversation. He was an early one. Of course, Scott and Claire Lowridge, who have been instrumental in our work and our life with the tool of the Enneagram and the Harmony Triad and all of that. Um, I remember, just different guests that I would ask and think it was a big ask. Jeff and Beth McCord came on just
Mhm.
recently. They've just been on the last
Yeah.
year and talked. So there are people that I had followed and that I had watched that it was just so cool to go, wow, they're coming on the podcast. But I think some of my favorite episodes, to be honest, are when we've gotten to feature one of our certified coaches. And we don't do it often. We do it when they're ready, when they have something to share with the world and offer with the world. But when we get to have them on, and it's maybe the very first podcast interview they've ever done, and they just feel just watching them light up and come to life and get to talk about their work in the world and how they are in their business and how they use the process in the work that they do. So some of those episodes to me have been really cool. I'm hoping to get into some more of those this fall,
Mhm.
as we've done a summer series about building your business and the 7 P's of business. But this fall to have some more interviews, it gives them a way to shine their light out in the world. And as you can tell by the name of the podcast now, Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches, that's really the shift that has happened in me since the sabbatical that I took last fall is how do I use the podcast as a way to
Mm.
shine the light for others as well.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm remembering one specific time we were on retreat up in Champaign, Illinois. It was
Yeah.
such a highlight.
Oh, that was
And
a great
we
one.
took our entire team. So we had, 5 mics, I think, at the time, and we're all around the table. And it was so cool to hear like the behind the scenes voices of people that we know are super impactful in the work that we do as coaches, just to bring all those voices to the table. So
Yeah.
just as you were speaking, I was just remembering and kind of being back
Yeah,
at the
I
table
forgot
again.
about that one.
That was such a fun episode.
And, 2 things about that episode stand out. Number one, my daughter, Annika, that works on
Yeah.
our team, it took everything in us. She, again, type 5 on the Enneagram, but it took and she was younger then than
Mm.
she is now. Now she's a mom and has the little grandbaby, Wesley, and all of the things. But back then, it's just not her personality to speak on a microphone. To get her to say her name was a big deal. And then our dear friend Terry, who also passed
Yeah.
away a few years ago, just she was on the podcast probably maybe 3, 4, maybe even 5 times.
Mhm.
I don't know. I should have gone back and looked. But those are treasured episodes for me, especially now that she's no longer with us, to have that content, to have her voice in places, and to know how she shaped the content that we put together as she worked here on the team and showed up in those spaces. And so, yeah, those are some great
Mm.
memories too, Erica, of just, I have so many pictures. When you say that, it reminds me too of recording an episode in a hotel room,
Mhm.
stacking books, stacking things to get my microphone right. Just recently in the last year, um, Lindsay and I, because we have a sister podcast, we actually do 2 podcasts. The Real Life Practice podcast, Lindsay Sturkey and I lead on spiritual practices. And I was trying to record an episode and I'd forgotten my mic stand. So I have it laying on books at just like the right level so I can get the mic and the
Mhm.
sound right. So there's a lot of behind the scenes to podcasting. You and I recently recorded a whole episode and I didn't hit record. So, we had to go back and do. Lindsay and I have done that. But it's one of the funnest things that I really get to do each and every week.
And from the feedback you've received, how has the podcast impacted listeners, and what surprised you most about the way God has used it?
Mm. You know, Again, this is kind of the business side, but I think that's what these conversations are about is the both and. So I'm always amazed. Podcasting is a very hard thing to track a KPI on or to track your impact by a number because the algorithms change all the time. When COVID happened, I mean, our numbers were fairly high, as you said. If you could be with 50 people, would you do it? And absolutely. I remember sitting in my living room the night that the podcast dropped or whatever, and Annika was there. She wasn't even married yet. And she was home with us and Dale. And I'm like, oh, we have 5 downloads. Oh, we have 10. And I remember like hitting 100 downloads and being so thrilled. So, and I didn't even take time for this episode to go look at our total downloads because again, we've changed platforms a couple of times. There's just it's hard to track a numeric impact with a podcast. So don't let that discourage you, I guess is what I would say on the business side. Just keep showing up and keep doing it. If it feels good, if you're benefiting from it, just keep putting it out there consistently. It's not super expensive to do a podcast. It really isn't. Um, but what I would say from the impact, I'm always amazed when I'll get on a call with someone or someone will join our certification cohort and they'll go, well, I've been listening to the podcast off and on for 2 years.
Mhm.
Podcasting is a long game. The consistency is important, whether you do it seasonally, like our sister podcast that does
Mhm.
episodes in seasons, or whether you do it weekly, like this podcast. It's a long game of I'm showing up each and every week, and through that, God uses it
Mm,
and uses your voice in the world. It's amazing to me. I mean, we have a certified coach in India. We have people in different parts of the world. When I go into our map and I see who's listening, I'm like,
mhm,
wow, who is listening in, some country I don't even know. I have to go look it up. So I think the impact that you hear, and of course, as I've shared our story, our family story of the loss of our son through addiction, um, just how the rule of life process has impacted me, and someone else reaches out and says, me too, or my
mm.
story mirrors yours, or I so relate to your authenticity of sharing. Thank you for putting it out there. Helps me to tell my story. Um, Whatever we do, I mean, the podcast is one way, the book has been another, her weekly email is another. All of those things are consistency
Mhm.
over almost 10 years now of consistency in all those places. That's what creates the impact, I think, over the long haul.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said it, no matter what the rhythm is, just continue. Just continue the rhythm. Keep showing up. Yeah. Well, we've looked back, we've used the rearview mirror. We moved a little more towards the windshield, just being present, kind of looking around. And so let's focus forward. The
Yeah.
windshield's the largest portion of the car and the journey. And so as we're looking forward here, just casting some vision, and celebrate this milestone, what do you see ahead for the next season of the podcast?
Well, I think some of that already started. So a year ago, you and I just looked back before we hit record in um, episode 294, I think we said, you actually joined the podcast as co-host. And I was starting to feel like I'm tired of listening to myself. I'm tired of, I need that. I love that conversational piece. And so when I would have guests on, I would always enjoy the back and forth. And so I was getting ready to go on sabbatical. And one of the biggest things is what am I going to do about the podcast? Because I did not want to let it be a gap. There was just
Yeah.
something in so many places in my life. I'm like, don't let it fall. I didn't feel pressure, but I asked you if you would consider coming on and co-hosting with me going forward. And also like help me cover that time. And we figured out a way to do that with you doing some introductions and some replays and things like that, just for your own capacity. And I think that was a shift that I've just enjoyed. Just to give a little backstory, Eric and I used to live in the same town, and she moved a few years ago, and that's been a great thing in her life and all of that. But yet, even the podcast gives us a way to connect on a weekly basis and say, okay, we're setting this time aside. We always do some chatting beforehand, but then to be in development of content with you and where do we want this to go? What do we want to do? That to me is huge. And I think in some ways it sounds really cliche, but the best is yet to come with
Yeah.
that. You have gotten much more comfortable in doing this rhythm and how we do it. We switched, was it back in January, to doing it on YouTube. So you can also find us on YouTube. I'll never forget when I said, hey, Erica, guess what? Like, first you just wanted my voice. Now you want me to be on video. And I have
I
just
think the
felt
first question was, no, when are we starting that? And the answer was tomorrow.
tomorrow, like we're doing video tomorrow. Are you okay with that? That's kind of how I do
Yeah.
everything. Are you okay with that? Sure, I'm okay with that. Um, and she's always game. So I love that about you. You'll take the risk. But I have seen you become much more comfortable over the past, even this summer. I've just noticed how just your voice in the room brings so much. There's times I want to go, wow, that's really good, Erica. Yeah. Because I'm one to kind of process out loud, and you're much more prepared and succinct in your language and your words. I edit the podcast every week, so I can, and she doesn't. know I'm going to say this, but I can go through and see like, okay, oh, we had a lot of ums in through there, or we had a lot of like, oh, retakes or whatever. So, and we go pretty raw and real. We don't edit much, but I, I just am excited about that and excited how we can share more, even as we've shifted the title.
Mhm.
That came after sabbatical. Last year, I took about 8 weeks and from kind of late October through the end of the year and really did discern like what's next and in all these things I'm doing from writing to speaking to podcasting to coaching to certification, what's next? And it felt like we needed to really narrow who we were speaking to.
Mhm.
And so we just recently made this shift to real life conversations for Christian coaches. Now, you don't have to be in that bucket to listen, obviously, but that is who we're imagining speaking to. And that is the group of people that we work with through our certification and through the network of coaches that we have ongoing that we meet with every single week. And I'm like, okay, God, what's the impact you want me to make in the world? It could be in lots of places. You're good at lots of things, Erica. I'm good at lots of things. And I don't say that with an ego. It's just that our talents and gifts could be used in many ways. But where do I feel called right now in this season of life to use them? And it's in
Mhm.
helping others grow their legacy work and their impact and what they feel God has called them to do. And I love that you're willing to come alongside in this podcast and in many other places within our business and do that. So yeah, I'm excited. What about you? What excites you for the future?
Mhm. Well, as you think about narrowing the focus, for some reason, as you're speaking about that, I always think about the little radio, like back in the day as people were gathered around listening. And it's exciting to think that something that has impacted my journey so richly, we have the opportunity to be generous. We have the opportunity to expand and use this platform to say somebody that's across the world could actually be in the living room with us.
Mhm.
And we can learn from them as they provide feedback and kind of resonate with stories. And it just creates connection. And so I'm excited about that. Just knowing that I'm going to continue to grow and learn. It always keeps me sharp. And challenges me as a coach to refine the message. As you said, how can I say it more concisely or ask a clearer question? And so it keeps me sharp, but I also continue just learning and growing. And so it's a fun way to really get in connection and network with other coaches that are on the journey.
It is. And there's something about podcasting, and there's all kinds of different ways to podcast. There's something about podcasting, though, that is very in the moment authentic. And I know some people reading from a script, we may have some notes, but we are never reading from a script. And so there is just some authenticity that I think comes through that sometimes uh, you and I both might be a little surprised that, oh, did I say that out loud? Did I share that? All the world could hear it. And yet there's something about going, no, that's my story. And that's who I am. And I want to be generous in my authenticity, the values that we have of being real, being present, bringing joy, creating impact. Those are our core values here at the Real Life Process, and they all come through in the podcast.
Mm.
It's a very present place to be. I remember working with a podcast coach, and he's like, somebody puts their earbuds in and goes for a walk and takes you with them.
Mm.
And that's a very intimate, present place that they're allowing you to go into their head
Mhm.
as they're forming thoughts and they're creating. And I know for me as a podcast listener, I might listen to 5 minutes of something and I shut it off and I just think there. I just dwell there and go, wow, it's a new idea. I hadn't considered that. And then I may come back to that podcast. I may never come back to it. I get that. That's what I say about the impact. You can't go by the numbers because you don't know what little thought you gave them. So I'm
Mm.
just grateful that you're on the journey with me in this. I'm grateful that Lindsay does the journey with me over on the other side. They're very different, but obviously I love them because we do two of them and they overlap and they speak back and forth. But yeah, I'm grateful to both of you for just leaning in and saying, sure, let's see what this has. 350 episodes. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Mm, it is. Well, we've walked through some history of how the podcast started, where we are today. And even that word, I think, is so impactful when you think about it. It's his story.
Hmm.
And it's his story through the voices that your voice, the voices of us co-hosts, but also the guests. And so what a joy it's been to really look back and celebrate this journey, Teresa. It's 350 episodes is such a milestone. And it's clear that God has been faithful every step of the way.
Mm, yes, he has been. And the practice of review that we talk about in the fourth component of the process of how do I sustain something? As sustainability comes a lot from the looking back and looking forward and where am I still growing? What does God have for me in the future? Pausing to celebrate, but also looking ahead. And so I'm excited, but I will say, a podcast is just out there in the air unless somebody listens. And
Mhm.
so I just want to be grateful to all of those, whether you're a brand new listener, whether you've listened to all 350 episodes, and we know some of you have, it is the reason that we're showing up week after week. So we'd love to just connect with you, continue in this relationship, encourage you, support you, and we're grateful for you and for your feedback.
Mm. Yeah. And even as you're saying that specifically, Teresa, the gratitude, I mean, we would love to hear from you as part of this celebration. We'd love to bring your voice into the room. So as you take a moment and reflect and review with us, what has been one of your favorite episodes or takeaways that's
Mhm.
impacted you from the podcast? So we would love to invite you to post on our free community platform. You can go to the realifeprocess.com/community and just click the join the community button there. That's the easiest way to get in. But we spell real life with one L. But post there and share. What is your takeaway? What's your favorite episode from the podcast? And bring your voice into the conversation.
Yeah, we'd love to hear. And even as we've niched down to real life conversations for Christian coaches, if there's something that you'd love for us to bring as a topic that you'd love for us to dive into, let us know. We want to serve in that way. We don't have all the answers. We don't claim to. We're both in it though, coaching almost daily with our clients, with our coaches in our network. And we live this out, and that's what we want to bring. But we'd love to talk about those things. As we close, our hope is that this episode inspired you just a little bit to practice your own review. This is a great time. We're recording this here in the fall to look back and look forward. What does the rest of the year have for you? What has it had so far? Even starting to think about what does next year bring for you? What's your desires and your longings in that space? And so looking back and looking forward and leaning in to the next chapter, just like we're doing here on the podcast. This has been a fun moment, a little longer episode than we normally do, but a fun moment to just look back. You all know I've done it for 350 episodes and just still feel the same feelings and emotions every time I close the podcast, because to me, this is an extraordinary moment. Just remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them.
Thanks for listening. And we will see you next time on Real Life Conversations for Christian Coaches.